I'm Elizabeth Oldfield, and I would love to invite you to our next The Sacred Live podcast recording with Caitlin Moran. It's going to be on May the 6th in a beautiful, intimate venue in central London. And we'll be talking to Caitlin about her career as a Times columnist, her screenplays, her books, her deep values, her life, and particularly this topic that she's written on most regularly: women, men, and how we might understand each other across these divides. It's going to be a really lovely evening. There is an early bird code in the show notes for those of you who want to go and get your tickets sorted now. I really look forward to seeing lots of you there.
We were worried about, ID cards back in the day, which had very, very basic information about somebody on. But if you think about the amount of information that you give to the tech companies through using a so-called free email account, you're giving a huge amount away. I think there's so many different reasons why the UK voted for Brexit in 2016 and why, indeed, America voted for Trump.
How do you steady yourself, particularly during that high peak Brexit years when you were a hate figure for a lot of people?
It's a great question.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast of the deepest values of the people shaping our common life. My guest today is Matthew Elliott, who sits in the House of Lords, is the president of the Jobs Foundation, the CEO of Vote Leave, and the founder and CEO of the Taxpayers Alliance. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
I want to ask you about your deep values. The way I frame it is, what's sacred to you? What are you trying to live by? What are you trying to orient your life by? But you can take that in any direction you want. Challenge the premise. Just tell me, what did it throw up for you as a question?
It's a really tough question. It's one I don't really have a pat answer to, so I'm glad you gave me some time to think about it. But really, I think at the core, it's using the skills and gifts I've been given to help change society for the better. That's the core of, I think, my sort of mission in life and what I find sacred. And, just to unpick that a little bit, in terms of the sort of skills I really have, it's the whole idea of coalition building. Mm-hmm. It's being able to bring about public policy change. It's, communications and strategy, everything goes along with that. Mm. And, I've been doing that for, 25 years now. And, of course, along the way, there have always been those sort of moments where, perhaps after a big campaign, there's been that opportunity to go to the private sector and go into public affairs or become a sort of professional lobbyist and that side of things, and sort of go off and do it like that for something else, for a business or an individual or corporation. But I've always felt drawn back to and felt most happy when I've been doing it for a cause I believed in. Yeah. And there's been a whole bunch of causes across my career, but for each of them, it's been an issue which has been of the time that I felt very deeply about and want to do my bit to, as I feel, change the world in the right direction in that area.
Yeah. So this is a really tough question, but I often think about this and I think I don't fully know what my answer is. So we can grasp around to something together. But when you say kind of make the world better or in the right direction, what are the sort of key values or the key guiding principles that are in your vision of what that might be?
I think it really depends on the issue. I don't really have a sort of pat, this is my big picture worldview and my views on every little issue.
Me neither.
And that, in a sense, is why I've never been particularly partisan in my approach. And, broadly speaking, I'm on the centre right of things. I take the Conservative whip in the House of Lords. I'm happy to do that. But I'm not really, in a sense, a card-carrying Conservative, and that's everything that drives me, and I believe in everything they do. Yeah. I've really, in a sense, taken things issue by issue, and we could run through all of them. I won't bore you with them, but why did I say that taxpayers less by 20s? I could see that government spending was going up, tax was going up. I could see that money was being wasted. That really annoyed me. It really annoyed me that money was being wasted, that people have worked really hard to earn and pay their taxes on and give to the government, and then it's being wasted. So I wanted to set up a group to basically campaign against that. And just to be really clear, I'm not saying I'm right on every issue, but what I've been campaigning on has been things that I feel are right and moving the dial in the right direction.
Yeah, that's really helpful. One thing I've observed from doing this talking to people for 8 years is this is a difference, I think, between guests and friends of mine who would, and this is, you need a compass, not a spectrum. And also all of these labels are unhelpful in some ways, but those who would self-describe as more kind of left, centre-left, liberal, progressive or whatever, more right, centre-right, conservative, traditionalist, whatever it is. Like and we'll talk this about just personalities and temperaments and how they play into this. But I think that those who would sit broadly on the left, for want of a better, do tend to have a bigger, like a more encompassing vision of what would make a better world, right? What would make a good life. And be trying to work towards it in ways that means they're often trying to tackle quite interconnected systems. It's a complicated thing to have a vision and be trying to move towards it across a very wide range of issues. But my friends on the right, there's a default, it's a huge generalization, but okay, here's my hypothesis. There's a default pragmatism.
Yeah.
And it's much more, I can see something that looks broken.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and fix that.
Right.
And I'm actually not going to necessarily overthink how that connects to every other system and do this mass zoom out thing. Have you noticed that?
I have noticed that. I can give you an example, actually. I'm part of one of the advisory council of the Together Coalition, this group that was brought together by Justin Welby and Brendan Cox was very involved, and Sunday Cotwell, who you've interviewed before. And they're involved in bringing this coalition together sort of basically during the COVID period, just after COVID. In a sense, it's about bringing society back together post-COVID, post-Brexit, trying to sort of mend those links. And I've been very proud to be part of that coalition. It's done great things.
Yeah.
But I remember a meeting we had shortly before the general election. And they were thinking about, in policy terms, what should our key asks be for the political parties ahead of the general election in 2024. And they were quite sort of vague and fuzzy. And my input to the conversation was basically, well, hang on, if you get 10 minutes with Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Ed Davey to basically give them your ask, or if the person writing the manifesto says to you, okay, what specifically do you want? What piece of legislation will be going into Parliament to change things, or what direction will be given to civil servants to bring about the change you want? What will that be? And it was quite unclear at the beginning what it was. So I guess I do like some quite specific changes sometimes, and you do need that to actually bring about change.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to get a sense of where you've come from. Would you tell me a bit about your childhood, particularly any big ideas that were in there, philosophical, political, religious? Just give me a sense of the world you were growing up in.
So I was born and brought up in Leeds, in a place called Hare Hills, which is in the city centre. A place of quite a lot of disadvantage, still is. I think the riot there after the local elections last year, and there were riots in the 80s there, and sort of quite a sort of melting pot area. My mum and dad, weren't particularly wealthy. My dad was a social worker, and he very much with his career kept on the front line of social work. He didn't want to progress up and take on more managerial positions, and because he wanted to actually be on the front line, actually helping people there.
Yeah.
And my mum was a stay-at-home mum, but then when we were slightly older, she went back to teaching in primary schools in Leeds, and then much later on became a non-stipendiary priest. Wow. What about Hales? We attended the local church, Hales Baptist Church. It was very sort of Christian upbringing, and for what lacked in terms of family wealth or money or anything like that, they really made up for by being great parents and giving us some really solid, a really solid Christian upbringing.
Interesting. And you, this is possibly prying, so feel free to push back, but got a scholarship therefore to Leeds Grammar School?
I was on an assisted placement scheme where the council paid a bit and my parents paid a bit. But that's really the reason why my mum went back to work, was to actually pay for the fees. And I'm not saying it's right for everybody, but going to LGS when I think it was 11, was the right fit for me. And academically, it really pushed me. It had a great tradition of music and choral music, which I loved. I liked the tradition of it. It was a great school for me.
If your school friends were asked at the time to describe you in 3 words, what would they have said?
Definitely very nerdy. I would have been the guy who, it's going to sound funny this, but it's sort of, I was in my sort of 11, it was secondary school, so I don't remember having a playground so much. But I was the guy who was, practicing the organ in the chapel, who when they went into the chapel service in the morning, would be the guy playing the hymn and playing the bit afterwards. I had some very close friends, often whom had a shared interest in politics. That's something that drawn to me. I still know a few of them, still in London. But I wouldn't say I had a hugely wide circle of friends there. But yeah, sort of class nerd stroke chapel organist.
And did the politics thing come from your parents? Were they politically orientated?
Hi, I wondered if I could ask for your help. You may have noticed that we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make this channel more beautiful, more enriching, more thought-provoking, and more life-giving. But 87% of you watching on this channel are not yet subscribed. So I wondered if you would just hit the little subscribe button. It means that you'll get these really thoughtful conversations in your feed, and it will also help other people find us. Thanks very much.
I remember, of course, the 80s were a very sort of political period. And I remember Sunday lunches at my grandfather's. And my grandfather was, a small businessman, had a corner shop in Birmingham after the war, and then went into food retail in Leeds. And he was much more of a sort of a Thatcherite. And at that sort of time, he liked what she was doing with tax and spend and her approach to things. And my dad in particular was, I wouldn't sort of say, I don't want to label him really, because I wouldn't say he's of the left, but he was a social worker. He was in the trade unions that you had to be. They went on strike. And I think he sort of came from more of a sort of a Christian sort of...
Christian socialism, maybe.
Christian socialism, but like not a Marxist.
Yes.
But but Christian socialist. But I think he's voted for all sorts of parties over the years, but very sort of community and society minded.
Yes. And this is so helpful. I find it helpful to become conscious of my two-dimensional assumptions and associations, and then realise I'm ridiculous again. And there is a bit of me that's like, oh, a vicar and a social worker, they must have been highly on the left. And I think what I'm hearing is it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And by the time you get to LSE, you are president, I think, of the Hayek Society?
So I was president, I think, after my first year. So I didn't found it, but it was founded by a friend of mine, Alistair Heath, who's now at the Sunday Telegraph as the editor there. And I think I was the president after him in the second year.
And how much was that kind of, and obviously that's an economic interest rather than necessarily coming with a cluster of political associations, but how much in your kind of political growing interest in your teens, was it clear that those were the ideas that you were drawn to? Or this is a pattern in people that are seen as sitting on the right politically in public, that often they've had, like Peter Hitchens, case in point, like a hard Marxist or a super left-wing teenagers. Did you have any of that, or was it straight to...
Oh, no. So I was, I joined the Conservative Party at an embarrassingly young age and was doing canvassing when I was, and delivering leaflets when I was like 10, 11, 12, that sort of thing.
Wow.
So I had that sort of party politics angle. So a huge interest in politics, and
was that
almost
from your granddad? Was it something you could bond over, or?
Yes, we sort of bonded over that. But I've just always been interested. I remember sort of conversation I had with my best friend, who I'm still in touch with, when we were sort of in our 7, 8, 9 about banning the bomb, literally. When that was a huge issue, sort of CND marches all also. I remember talking about that with him and being sort of very passionately in favour of nuclear weapons.
Wow.
Not very coherently argued, but I had my beliefs.
7, 8 and 9.
And that sort of grew in my sort of teenage years. And then another sort of key point was when I did my A-level economics. The economics teacher basically taught us, of course, using the textbook as well, but also with Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, which was a book written in the late 70s, early 80s, basically about free enterprise and free market economics. Yeah. And he taught us basically using that. So my belief in free enterprise and really comes from that in a sense, but hopefully over the years, more considered and more deeper.
Yeah. Do you think that some people have a more conservative-leaning temperament? How much do you think personality plays in these kind of political intuitions that we come to?
I think I've definitely changed over the year myself. And as you say, obviously I came from more of a sort of Christian, perhaps even Christian socialist parents, but a father who was more on the centre-right. I'd like to think I sort of thought these things through, and I think I did.
We all would. And that's part of it, right? It's definitely part of it.
It's difficult to pick. But had you asked me this, 20 years ago when I was doing the TPA, I probably would have said, well, I listened to my grandfather at the Sunday table and he was saying how things are right and, didn't we have great economic growth in the late 80s and 90s and he clearly was right and, therefore I took all my politics from him. But then actually sort of looking back now, I've learned a lot from my parents as well. And I talked about the value of service and service to your community. And my parents did that, being a social worker. And, that is literally service at the front line to your local community. And I remember during the Brexit referendum, actually just afterwards, I got a DM on Twitter from somebody who said, I completely hate what you did with Brexit, hate what you did with the referendum. But I want to tell you how much your dad helped me. And that meant a lot. So that's a huge, huge thing. My skills are very different. I don't do that sort of line of things. It's not me. But what I can do, what I've learned from that is basically how can you use the skills which you've been given to actually try and sort of change society for the better. And for me, it's really shifting that dial on public policy, building those coalitions to actually bring about change. And that's what I like to do, sort of behind the scenes quietly.
So lots of people listening to or watching this won't have heard of Hayek or know, I admit I have some loose associations, but I'm not sure I've ever read it. Could you say and you've talked about the free market thing, could you just say a little bit more about what is that philosophy that, was so formative for you in the Taxpayers Alliance, for example? What's it saying about the world and what a good society looks like?
If you look at Hayek, he comes from the what you call the sort of classical liberal tradition, which a lot of people interpret as being, it's all about perhaps a much smaller state than we have at the moment. Yeah. But then when people think about that, they often think, okay, well, it's a much smaller state. That's a much more atomized society, a much more individualistic society, one where people perhaps aren't looked after, are much harsher, and that'd be the sort of standard sort of critique of that way of thinking. But actually, there's a softer side to it, which is what I subscribe to, which is basically that the state and government have a role to play, but actually also society at large and civil society at large also a role to play, which is equally important. And this has been sort of one of my sort of driving views. You can actually get a situation where government and the public sector actually start to crowd out what civil society and society at large could and should be doing.
By that we mean kind of charities, membership organisations, congregations.
even businesses.
Yeah.
If you start thinking that the government is doing everything for you, that almost means that as society at large, families, communities, individuals almost have no responsibility towards others. Whereas if you take what I'm doing at the moment with the Jobs Foundation, I believe really passionately that businesses have a role to play, not just in earlier profit and running the business and that side of things, which is really important. That's what companies do. That's what makes companies exist. But they have a responsibility towards their employees. They have a role to play in society in terms of creating those jobs, employing people, training them, helping them with their social mobility. And if you talk to most business leaders, almost all business leaders I speak to, feel a very deep, that's a deep part of their passion. And especially you speak to businesses that have been set up by entrepreneurs and family-run businesses, they will describe the employees they have as an extended family. And I could give you, countless examples of business leaders who really go out of their way to look after their employees. And when they've been in difficulty, perhaps when they've had an illness of some kind, have had to take extended periods of time off work, they will continue paying the wages of those people because they feel that deep sense of responsibility. So to come back to your question, I come from more of a sort of classical liberal tradition, sort of Hayekian tradition. But that doesn't mean basically just leave people to rot, don't have a care for other people. It does mean that actually if the government isn't doing everything it does at the moment, that actually we have to step up as society, as businesses, as individuals to actually help other people. And why is that important? Because if you have a society like that, first of all, I think you have greater bonds between people, but also, frankly, to actually get the growth and the prosperity that we need, if government becomes too big and taxes everybody too much, growth falls. And that's the situation we're now in.
Yeah. So that, is it fair to describe it as a sort of scepticism that government is always the best place to get stuff done?
I'm over that.
It makes complete sense in driving the Taxpayers Alliance. I'm interested in the Big Brother Watch element of what you've been involved in, because obviously that started as a kind of like pushback against government intrusion, right? Government surveillance, them having access to all our data.
CCTV was a big part of it. ID cards.
ID cards. These moments where it felt like there was a government overreach to wanting to know more about the citizens than they needed to. How much now, and this is just something I'm personally interested in, it feels like that question of surveillance is as equally an issue with businesses, right? Particularly global corporations. How has that changed your thinking? Or I'd love you to just reflect on that out loud for me about that privacy thing, which is clearly also a deep value for you.
Yeah. When I set up Big Brother Watch, a lot of it was directed at, should we say, government intrusion. So whether it's, CCTV from the government or ID cards and issues like that. I must say that now, of course, there is an equal element, if not bigger element, in terms of intrusion from, let's say, tech companies. We were worried about ID cards back in the day, a couple of decades ago, which had very, very basic information about somebody on. But if you think about the amount of information that you give to the tech companies through using, a free email account, a so-called free email account, or going on so-called free websites, you're giving a huge amount away. And I'm glad that people are now much more aware of that and see the value in that, and moves being made towards people being able to, protect more of their own individual information. So for me, I'm quite sceptical about, yes, of course, big government, but also, big corporates and big overreaching organisations and bureaucracy quite generally, and take perhaps slightly more sort of individualistic look at things. And that sort of scepticism towards bigger institutions has been a sort of constant theme throughout my thought.
Interesting. Because I think I come to some similar intuitions from a much more communitarian perspective.
Right.
And I wanted to ask if you think that when you're, because a lot of your work has been about championing the role of business, so we're sitting in our community house. There is a building company in, very kindly being quiet for an hour. And it is a joy to watch. The person who runs that, this is weird, that's going to make me tearful. The person who runs that company is exactly what you've said.
Yeah.
High integrity, high trust. I can see the way he works with employees. He brings people in who might need skills, teaches them skills. Yeah. Like, wonderful example of a relationally focused business doing good in the world and getting stuff done. And it's just, it's not a B Corp. It's not doesn't have any particular designation. And it feels to me like I can totally buy that argument for businesses up to a certain scale.
Yep.
And then once the actual human relationships begin to fray because you're in different countries, the governance is very opaque. Where money is going, where decision-making is happening, particularly these global corporations, these tech corporations seem to me to just have completely outsized power over all of our lives. I would then want to make a really clear distinction between businesses that can be a force for good and businesses that almost in their very makeup, I don't trust them. But for me, that's for my kind of relational theology things. But as you're talking about business in public, do you feel the need? Do you make that distinction? And where does it sit for you?
I think it's true that the bigger a business gets, the further away the ultimate, business owner or CEO, or in a sense, anonymous shareholder, is from the employee on the ground at the front. So, of course, those businesses have to go to work even harder to do good work in this area. But I could point to lots of bigger corporations that actually work hard to have apprenticeship schemes and training schemes that actually really sort of look after those skills. You have a big company like Timson's, for example, who's done fantastic work in terms of rehabilitating ex-offenders and giving them jobs.
Yeah.
What a joy to see that. Yeah, that's an amazing story of success. There are big companies like Itsu, the lotteries buy lunch from, or Pret. And they've got schemes to actually help homeless people into work. So you can do it as a bigger company. I think obviously with a smaller company, you are close to the people you work with, especially it comes more naturally to you. You don't need specific schemes, but I think both can actually do it.
Okay. We'll come back to that for your work on the Jobs Foundation, but we want to talk a lot about the Leave campaign. Want to talk a little bit about the Leave campaign. And obviously hearing that you are sceptical of bureaucracy and government makes sense as to why. Was a kind of scepticism towards the EU always a thread, or did it crystallise as it became clear there might be an opportunity to bring some change?
I think it was always a thread. So even going back to, the early 90s, where I just formed my thinking, I was quite sceptical about the Maastricht Treaty and what was happening there, where the EU went from being more of an economic unit to being more of a political union. That I was sceptical about that. I was very sceptical about us giving up the pound and adopting the euro. I remember in my sixth form, for like a student's magazine, writing an essay about why we shouldn't give up the pound. So I always had sort of that as part of my belief. I wasn't a Brexiteer, somebody who believes we should actually leave the EU, until much further down the line. So when I set up Business for Britain in 2013, that was after David Cameron had done a Bloomberg speech. This was a Bloomberg speech where he announced this whole idea of having a referendum and sort of renegotiating our membership beforehand, and set out some quite clear things that he wanted to see from that renegotiation. And I was fine with that. And actually the position of BFB was to actually say, look, we support having a referendum, we support this approach. We support his aspirations for what Britain's relationship with the EU should be like. We agree with that. And that's what we campaigned for. But what became very clear after the 2015 general election, once it was sort of game on for that referendum, he basically, within a month, said there wouldn't be any treaty change. So there wouldn't really be any significant change to our relationship with the EU.
Yeah.
And that's where we went from sort of being a supporter of that change to actually saying we should go.
Right.
And actually say we should actually leave the EU because it wasn't going to change and wasn't right for the UK's purpose.
Yeah. And you played a really key role in that movement. I'm much less interested in the sort of details of the rights and wrongs of that.
Sure.
I think that's been hashed over for many years.
Yeah.
I am personally very interested in division and polarization and how we live together. And this podcast launched in 2017 as part of a response to 2016, both in the States and here, and a sense that our ability to talk to people who believe different things. I remember a particular dinner where the topic of Brexit made the entire evening incredibly awkward because I have friends from different political persuasions and they could not be in the room together. Yeah. And I would love to talk to the people who worked on the Remain campaign about this, but in fact I have. And he reflects on the things they did in the Remain campaign and what he would do differently now. And it's shaped the work he's doing now around polarization and division. But looking back, I guess I would love to know whether you think it is an issue that was always going to get like this, or whether there are ways that it played out. One of the very first interviews for the Sacred was a guy called Jonathan Rowson, and we talked about Brexit itself having become sacred, having moved from actually quite a technical geopolitical governance thing, right, which could have been very dry and passed most people by, to something that it felt like sucked in all the other values and all the other identities and drove a wedge between us. Is there anything you would do differently, anything you felt like you learned from that, particularly around this issue of how we live together and then how we don't?
That's such a big question.
I know, it's huge. And I don't expect a neat answer.
I think there's so many different reasons why the UK voted for Brexit in 2016 and why, indeed, America voted for Trump in 2016. And you can't just put it down to the very sort of dry, sort of legalistic, where a decision's made and who makes our laws. And, it's not just purely through that prism. Mm-hmm. And I think you really have to take a much, basically what happened in the decade plus before then. The global financial crisis was a key turning point. That was a really crucial point when, obviously, taxpayers bailed out the banks. Took on huge amounts of government debt to actually bail out the banks. And then if you look at that period from 07, 08 through to 2016, you had a situation where essentially people's living standards didn't rise at all.
Right.
So people weren't any wealthier, and yet and then they got a sense that basically the banks had been let off. That led to a sort of degree of scepticism. During that period as well, you had a feeling that politicians were lying to people. If you look at the issue of migration, which is actually one element of the reason Brexit, not the only one as people say, but one element of it.
Yeah.
You're in a situation where when the European Union expanded, Tony Blair and his government were saying to people that only a few thousand people would come to the UK every year, and it ended up being tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So a very big difference between what was said and what actually happened and what people experienced. And then you had the feeling that, just generally, that British politicians, Conservative Labour, it's not a partisan point, had started sort of blaming the EU for things. So, we can't do that. It's the EU matter, or the EU's to blame for that happening. And people are thinking, well, let's take back control. Why can't we do this on our own with the fifth largest economy in the world? Why can't we make our own decisions? Why aren't our politicians basically taking control and taking responsibility for what they're doing? So there are a whole host of reasons why things came about. Obviously, I accept the fact it was very divisive. It was a big political issue. It was an important campaign. Election campaigns now are very divisive. If you look at any country across the world, that's how sort of politics is generally done.
Yeah.
I do hope that politicians work together on other issues. And I actually say that the years after the Brexit, it was tough on all sides. I could point to situations where, my wife and I were invited to dinner parties, and we'd turn up, and we were basically there to be argued with.
Right.
We were brought in there to be so they could argue with us and tell us how wrong we were. That's basically the reason why we've been brought there.
Yeah.
Another example of, I was in correspondence with somebody on, of all places, LinkedIn. They started sort of sending me different articles I thought I'd be interested in. And a guy who worked at, works at a company, but a major oil company. And he worked around the corner from me. He wanted to say, would you mind meeting up? We have correspondence, so fine, we'll meet up. On the day, he sent me a message saying he mentioned to his boss that he was going to meet me, and he wasn't allowed to.
Wow.
And so bizarre things like that.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, is that now, sort of 8 years on, I think things have calmed down a lot. And certainly within the, I should make it clear, within the Jobs Foundation, it is not a Brexit organisation, and we have, many Remainers working for us on the team and on the Advisory Council and the Business Council. There's nothing to do with Brexit as an organisation. So I'd like to now think that people can actually start moving on and think about other issues and working together across that political divide.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true in your team, right?
Yeah,
team. Yes, I think I come around to this all the time, and it's particularly when I'm talking to people who are involved in politics or campaigning. That phrase, this is how politics is done now. I get that something of that, and it happens in business as well. Well, this is just how business is done, and I always want to say we get to make choices, and there is a default culture, and this is just possibly my kind of kumbaya approach to the world, but I want us to take seriously the impact of making short-term decisions, whether it's in business or whether it's in campaigning, that dehumanize each other, right? That win by making the other guys less human. And I think, it's a personal puzzle for me. Am I just naive and I've never been at the coalface? And if I was, I would be doing exactly the same tactics that I see from different perspectives politically. I see it around lots of climate campaigning. I think that's just so short-sighted in how people work. It's very easy for me to judge from the outside. I'd love to talk about the Jobs Foundation and why that's now the issue that you're really drawn to.
So the idea for the Jobs Foundation really goes back to the period during COVID. And at the time I was living in Brixton, Streatham, and that's where I'd had my lockdown. And what really struck me during that point was actually how much local businesses were doing for their area and how that was massively underappreciated. It was quite right that we did our bit to praise the role of public sector workers and people in the NHS and people in social care during that period. But nobody's really actually sort of standing up and saying, actually, there are businesses out there who are actually doing their bit as well during this period to actually, keep society and the country going. And this got me thinking about the role of business in society more and how businesses portrayed and, the good things that business does, the bad things that business does. But what really struck me was actually there's a huge role that business plays that was massively underappreciated in terms of the particularly the jobs it provides and creates, the training it gives people, the way that helps people transform their lives through social mobility. And that whole story wasn't really being told. And this was during the point, of course, during COVID when there's lots of focus on net zero, lots of focus on with Black Lives Matter on sort of diversity, that sort of agenda, and those are sort of key themes that whether you're sort of corporates or countries, you're talking a lot about that. But nobody was talking about this other thing, which seemed really important to me, was basically the role that businesses can play in their local communities in terms of actually helping individuals and families through that provision of jobs. That was really the sort of driving force for the setting up the Jobs Foundation. Slightly different to what I've done before, in the sense that previous organisations have been campaign groups. This is actually a charity. So that's a new thing for me and a much longer process.
How are you finding that?
Up. it's a long process to set it up. But actually, once you get there, very worthwhile in the sense that people can actually see what our mission is, and I'm going more into that. And you can actually build an even broader and deeper and more committed coalition. It feels more permanent, if you like, about its change. And this need will be timeless. Getting people into work and will be a timeless issue. It will always be there, but particularly at this moment in time where post-COVID, the employment rate in the UK hasn't bounced back in the way in which it has in other countries. The Labour Party in the election talked about getting employment up to 80% of the country, which is sort of a normal amount, if you like. And that means getting 2 million people from welfare into work. And that's really the policy space where we're working at the moment. And a lot of work has been done, of course, by look at the role of charities in all of this and job centres. Labour Party will look about job centres and the role of that. What nobody's really addressed is the fact that if you're getting 2 million people into work, there are about 800,000 job vacancies at the moment. That means creating another 1.2 million jobs. Now, who's going to do that? It's going to basically be businesses up and down the country creating these jobs and make sure they're there for people. So actually the role of business in all of this, and businesses are employing people already. But I see it as being always like a bit of a national effort. Businesses need to rally round, create these jobs, employ people, get them back to work. That's a really important thing they've got to do. But at the same time, there's a role for government to basically make sure we've got the conditions within the UK for businesses to be thriving, for people wanting to be invested in the UK, setting up businesses, expanding, creating new jobs. There's that whole role as well. So this is very much a sort of, I'd say, non-party issue, but it's not Conservative or Labour. It's really, I would say, a national effort that requires both business to step up, but also government to step up to make sure businesses can thrive.
Yeah. I'm really hearing a bit about, I'm interested in cultural stories and the cultural story we tell about business. And I do think there is a kind of, I think I'm hearing you getting frustrated with a sort of business as bad guy story. And wanting to say business as social good, as serving the social good. How much, because obviously there's been this big growth in recent years in B Corps and people saying, yes, business can be for social good, but they need more scaffolding. The profit motive is a very strong driver and can sometimes crowd out social good. And so we need to have these regulatory changes, social enterprise or whatever. These businesses are more explicit about that part of why they exist. How do you feel about that movement? Is it something that you feel central to the Jobs Foundation, or are you not a fan? What's
interesting about the B Corp movement is that it covers many good areas. It doesn't actually cover that welfare to work area, which, for me, the helping individual people at the grassroots level, helping them into work, giving them a paycheck, helping them improve their lives, not just with that paycheck, but also with training, so they can improve their skills and advance within companies and go on to better jobs, that sort of thing. That's a crucial area of business. And that really isn't covered by any of the existing schemes. So I'm hoping that at the Jobs Foundation, as we sort of set up, start thinking through our accreditation scheme and launch that in the first part of 2026, we'll be filling that missing gap, which I think is so crucial. So it's not just any old jobs you're interested in creating, it's particularly for the people that might not otherwise have access to them. Correct. There are those 2 million people within the country at the moment who, need to get back into the work. The government wants to get back into work. And there's a whole set of knotty problems about getting them into work. And, of course, they're not, it's not a uniform group. There'll be, within that mix, certain specific areas where you've got deprivation there. There'll be different demographics. There's an issue with younger people at the moment in terms of getting younger people into work. So very small but really important demographics like ex-offenders or the homeless. They're the key ones. So we're looking at all these different areas this year, looking at all the businesses in this space who are doing great work so others can learn from them, looking at best practice. We're looking as well and talking with charities working in the space and learning from them about what they've learned. And then essentially the idea is to bring all this together to allow companies who want to do more in this area, rather than having to sort of set up a scheme and starting afresh, to be able to have that sort of best practice guide and have that mentorship from companies who are already working in this space to be able to do something themselves. So we're trying to be that catalyst within that situation to make some quite big changes happen.
I want to finish by asking something that, and this is just because I have overdeveloped pastoral instinct, but anyone in public life now has to deal with something that people 20, 25 years ago weren't dealing with, which is a very direct feedback from people.
Yeah.
Their political life has always been divisive. It's always been adversarial. People have disagreed on things. But particularly politicians that I've spoken to, but journalists, writer, left, right, traditionalist, libertarian, whatever, it is very common for people to be receiving a lot of backlash, a lot of abuse. You mentioned the difficulty of going for dinner just to be argued with. And I just wanted to ask how you navigate that. How do you steady yourself, particularly during that high peak Brexit years when you were a hate figure for a lot of people? How do you navigate the fact that can be formative for you in difficult ways? And I guess how do you live with it is my fundamental question.
It's a great question. I don't see myself as being a public figure, and I'm at my happiest when I'm basically operating behind the scenes. And that's not to be secretive, but it's being out there and sort of doing lots of interviews and tweeting all the time. It's not what I do. So I actually quite value my
your privacy. Yeah. Do you think that's protected you from some things?
I think so. Yes, but then again, I've got to know, why am I doing this interview today? So I want to spread the word about the Jobs for Nation. I believe in what we're doing, and I want to get businesses to step up and help employ people. That's why I do it. So I do it for a purpose. Yeah. Do I want to really go out there and basically sort of just talk about myself? No. So that is tough, but it comes with the job. You've got to do it. I sort of feel a little bit like, when you've got a vision for how something needs to change, and you've got to bring that about. So you've got to get out there and talk to people. And I've got my past, I've got my campaigns, which some of which people agree with, some of which people will disagree with. I hope people concentrate on the campaign that you're working on at that point in time. And I think my skill, if there's been one, really has been at that sort of coalition building side of things. So coming along with an idea, this is what we're going to do. Are you with me? Will you join with me on that? Will you join that coalition? Will you do your bit? That's really what I like to do. And that means putting myself out there sometimes. So usually it means working behind the scenes to actually build those coalitions.
Matthew Elliott, thank you so much for speaking to me on The Sacred.
A pleasure.
Well, that was a really interesting interview. The first thing to say is that having guests on who are just deeply private always leaves me in a bit of a quandary because I have overdeveloped pastoral instincts, and I also, I respect privacy as a value, and therefore don't want to pry and don't want to push too hard. I've never really had that kind of journalistic killer instinct that, people like Matthew generally would be dealing with, I think, if they were doing, interviews on the Today programme or with broadsheet journalists, that kind of thing. But I also do deeply want to understand someone, right? And I'm very curious about their deep values and what's going on behind the kind of public persona. So these two things are very much at war in me when I'm interviewing someone like Matthew. And the first thing I noticed was that actually his values were quite hard to get a hold of. And this word pragmatism came up quite a lot, both actually in the conversation and in how I was thinking about it, because he essentially said that what's sacred to him are using his gifts to make the world better. And when I probed a little bit and said, sort of, what do you mean by better? It was that very kind of practically minded thing of, rather than a big vision, what's the problem I can see in front of me and how can I fix it? You know, very much led by particular issues, although obviously in that Hayekian kind of free market economics worldview, in terms of particular concern that civil society is not crowded out by the state. And he also said by the market, which I wish I'd kind of dug into a little bit more, because he's so pro-business. And I wonder, actually, maybe that's not, maybe I'm filling in blanks. Maybe it's, he would see business as much more kind of part of the kind of civil society middle space that he doesn't want crowded out by the state. And I'm putting my own words, my own view in there. I'm so fascinated by where our political intuitions come from, and the role of relationships and the role of testimony and the role of personality. And I really loved digging into that a bit. And you will have seen that in my digging and in his talking about his dad, there was quite a lot of deep emotion in there. And again, it is one of the situations where I could really have pushed, and I wanted to, because actually the moment that someone is having real feelings in a conversation is where I think the most beautiful and humanizing moment can happen, right? You can have a real conversation that, as we see each other, even people who we might deeply disagree with on a whole range of issues, when we see that they are also a son, they are also someone navigating deep belonging and identity, and the tenderness of that, I think there's almost always something beautiful in it. But it is vulnerable and it is exposing, and the public square is brutal. Yeah. But I was just glad to see a little bit of that in Matthew. And then I was thinking about how my kind of particular calling to remind us to see each other and treat each other as fully human isn't always popular. It was about another guest about a completely different set of issues, but I have been criticised for trying to humanize people who other people don't want humanized, right? That if you really believe that someone is a very bad actor in the world, and that their particular position or campaign or religious belief or political belief or whatever it is, you know, wrong in a black and white way and deeply harmful, then what I'm doing in trying to complicate our two-dimensional understandings of people in public life is, you know, strategically unhelpful. And that's a value clash, because I think remembering that each other are fully human is what helps us stay fully human, even as we might need to push back, fight, disagree, campaign, engage with each other, wrestle and reckon with each other and our differences. Unless we can remember, unless we can guard our own and each other's full humanity, we're in some deep trouble. I was a little bit sad that he wouldn't reflect with me on the lasting effects of both the Leave and the Remain campaigns on the UK and on our ability to live together. I can understand why he didn't want to, and maybe there isn't anything in the strategy and tactics of the work that he did that he would do differently, but I wish he'd felt able to go a little bit deeper there. And I could also hear how much he really wanted to move on from that chapter, how much his current focus is, it feels like the kind of thing that he wants to be his legacy, you know, the sense of getting people into work who might struggle to get into work, you know, people who have been homeless, people who have been in prison, and the passion there actually for the role that businesses can play. I was really glad to get to communicate some of my kind of prejudices, but also challenges with this and how it intersects with my values around relationality and the power of relational businesses. But my ongoing, really deep skepticism and suspicion that big businesses purely motivated by profit, who don't have, past a certain scale, whether they can in fact be a force for good. And I think that's one of our differences. But as I say again and again, differences are okay. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and our production team are Amari Yagandran, Daniel Turner and Lizzie Harvey. The Sacred is a project of the think tank Theos, and we would love you to go and check out our wider work. I'll speak to you next time.